Chapter 3. The Eagle's Emanations. The next day, Don Juan and I went for a walk along the road to the city of Oaxaca. The road was deserted at that hour. It was 2 p.m. As we strolled leisurely, Don Juan suddenly began to talk. He said that our discussion about the petty tyrants had been merely an introduction to the topic of awareness. I remarked that it had opened a new view for me. He asked me to explain what I meant. I told him that it had to do with an argument we had had some years before about the Yaqui Indians. In the course of his teachings for the right side, he had tried to tell me about the advantages that the Yaquis could find in being oppressed. I had passionately argued that there were no possible advantages in the wretched conditions in which they lived. And I had told him that I could not understand how, being a Yaqui himself, he did not react against such a flagrant injustice. He had listened attentively. Then, when I was sure he was going to defend his point, he agreed that the conditions of the Yaqui Indians were indeed wretched. But he pointed out that it was useless to single out the Yaquis when life conditions of man in general were horrendous. Don't just feel sorry for the poor Yaqui Indians, he had said. Feel sorry for mankind. In the case of the Yaqui Indians, I can even say they're the lucky ones. They are oppressed, and because of that, some of them may come out triumphant in the end. But the oppressors, the petty tyrants that tread upon them, they don't have a chance in hell. I had immediately answered him with a barrage of political slogans. I had not understood his point at all. He again tried to explain to me the concept of petty tyrants, but the whole idea bypassed me. It was only now that everything fit into place. Nothing has fit into place yet, he said, laughing at what I had told him. Tomorrow, when you are in your normal state of awareness, you won't even remember what you realize now. I felt utterly depressed, for I knew he was right. What's going to happen to you is what happened to me, he continued. My benefactor, the Nahual Julian, made me realize in heightened awareness what you have realized yourself about petty tyrants. And I ended up, in my daily life, changing my opinions without knowing why. I had always been oppressed, so I had real venom toward my oppressors. Imagine my surprise when I found myself seeking the company of petty tyrants. I thought I had lost my mind. We came to a place on the side of the road where some large boulders were half buried by an old landslide. Don Juan headed for them and sat down on a flat rock. He signaled me to sit down, facing him. And then, without further preliminaries, he started his explanation of the mastery of awareness. He said that there were a series of truths that seers, old and new, had discovered about awareness, and that such truths had been arranged in a specific sequence for purposes of comprehension. He explained that the mastery of awareness consisted in internalizing the total sequence of such truths. The first truth, he said, was that our familiarity with the world we perceive compels us to believe that we are surrounded by objects, existing by themselves and as themselves, just as we perceive them. Whereas, in fact, there is no world of objects, but a universe of the eagle's emanations. He told me then that before he could explain the eagle's emanations, he had to talk about the known, the unknown, and the unknowable. Most of the truths about awareness were discovered by the old seers, he said. But the order in which they were arranged had been worked out by the new seers. And without that order, those truths were nearly incomprehensible. He said that not to seek order was one of the great mistakes that the ancient seers made. A deadly consequence of that mistake was their assumption that the unknown and the unknowable are the same thing. It was up to the new seers to correct that error. They set up boundaries and defined the unknown as something that is veiled from man, shrouded perhaps by a terrifying context, but which, nonetheless, is within man's reach. The unknown becomes the known at a given time. The unknowable, on the other hand, is the indescribable, the unthinkable, the unrealizable. It is something that will never be known to us, and yet it is there, dazzling, and at the same time horrifying in its vastness. How can seers make the distinction between the two? I asked. There is a simple rule of thumb, he said. In the face of the unknown, man is adventurous. It is a quality of the unknown to give us a sense of hope and happiness. Man feels robust, exhilarated. Even the apprehension that it arouses is very fulfilling. The new seers saw that man is at his best in the face of the unknown. He said that whenever what is taken to be the unknown turns out to be the unknowable, the results are disastrous. Seers feel drained, confused. A terrible oppression takes possession of them. Their bodies lose tone. Their reasoning and sobriety wander away aimlessly. For the unknowable has no energizing effects whatsoever. It is not within human reach. Therefore, it should not be intruded upon foolishly or even prudently. The new seers realized that they had to be prepared to pay exorbitant prices for the faintest contact with it. Don Juan explained that the new seers had had formidable barriers of tradition to overcome. At the time when the new cycle began, none of them knew for certain which procedures of their immense tradition were the right ones and which were not. Obviously, something had gone wrong with the ancient seers, but the new seers did not know what. They began by assuming that everything their predecessors had done was erroneous. Those ancient seers had been the masters of conjecture. They had, for one thing, assumed that their proficiency in seeing was a safeguard. They thought that they were untouchable. That is, until the invaders smashed them and put most of them to horrendous deaths. The ancient seers had no protection whatsoever, despite their total certainty that they were invulnerable. The new seers did not waste their time in speculations about what went wrong. Instead, they began to map the unknown in order to separate it from the unknowable. How did they map the unknown, Don Juan? I asked. Through the controlled use of seeing, he replied. I said that what I had meant to ask was, what was entailed in mapping the unknown? He answered that mapping the unknown means making it available to our perception. By steadily practicing seeing, the new seers found that the unknown and the known are really on the same footing, because both are within the reach of human perception. Seers, in fact, can leave the known at a given moment and enter into the unknown. Whatever is beyond our capacity to perceive is the unknowable, and the distinction between it and the knowable is crucial. Confusing the two would put seers in a most precarious position whenever they are confronted with the unknowable. When this happened to the ancient seers, Don Juan went on, they thought their procedures had gone haywire. It never occurred to them that most of what's out there is beyond our comprehension. It was a terrifying error of judgment on their part, for which they paid dearly. What happened after the distinction between the unknown and the unknowable was realized? I asked. The new cycle began, he replied. That distinction is the frontier between the old and the new. Everything that the new seers have done stems from understanding that distinction. Don Juan said that seeing was the crucial element in both the destruction of the ancient seers' world and in the reconstruction of the new view. It was through seeing that the new seers discovered certain undeniable facts, which they used to arrive at certain conclusions, revolutionary to them, about the nature of man and the world. These conclusions which made the new cycle possible were the truths about awareness he was explaining to me. Don Juan asked me to accompany him to the center of town for a stroll around the square. On our way, we began to talk about machines and delicate instruments. He said that instruments are extensions of our senses, and I maintained that there are instruments that are not in that category because they perform functions that we are not physiologically capable of performing. Our senses are capable of everything, he asserted. I can tell you offhand that there are instruments that can detect radio waves that come from outer space, I said. Our senses cannot detect radio waves. I have a different idea, he said. I think our senses can detect everything we are surrounded by. What about the case of ultrasonic sounds? I insisted. We don't have the organic equipment to hear them. It is the seer's conviction that we've tapped a very small portion of ourselves, he replied. He immersed himself in thought for a while, as if he were trying to decide what to say next. Then he smiled. The first truth about awareness, as I've already told you, he began, is that the world out there is not really as we think it is. We think it is a world of objects, and it's not. He paused, as if to measure the effects of his words. I told him that I agreed with his premise, because everything could be reduced to being a field of energy. He said that I was merely intuiting a truth, and that to reason it out was not to verify it. He was not interested in my agreement or disagreement. He said, but in my attempt to comprehend what was involved in that truth. You cannot witness fields of energy, he went on. Not as an average man, that is. Now, if you were able to see them, you would be a seer, in which case you would be explaining the truths about awareness. Do you understand what I mean? He went on to say that conclusions arrived at through reasoning had very little or no influence in altering the course of our lives. Hence, the countless examples of people who have the clearest convictions and yet act diametrically against them time and time again, and have as the only explanation for their behavior the idea that to err is human. The first truth is that the world is as it looks, and yet it isn't, he went on. It's not as solid and real as our perception has been led to believe. But it isn't a mirage either. The world is not an illusion, as it has been said to be. It's real on the one hand, and unreal on the other. Pay close attention to this, for it must be understood, not just accepted. We perceive. This is a hard fact. But what we perceive is not a fact of the same kind, because we learn what to perceive. Something out there is affecting our senses. This is the part that is real. The unreal part is what our senses tell us is there. Take a mountain, for instance. Our senses tell us that it is an object. It has size, color, form. We even have categories of mountains, and they are downright accurate. Nothing wrong with that. The flaw is simply that it has never occurred to us that our senses play only a superficial role. Our senses perceive the way they do because a specific feature of our awareness forces them to do so. I began to agree with him again, but not because I wanted to, for I had not quite understood his point. Rather, I was reacting to a threatening situation. He made me stop. I've used the term, the world, Don Juan went on, to mean everything that surrounds us. I have a better term, of course, but it would be quite incomprehensible to you. Seers say that we think there is a world of objects out there, only because of our awareness. But what's really out there are the ego's emanations, fluid, forever in motion, and yet unchanged, eternal. He stopped me with a gesture of his hand, just as I was about to ask him what the ego's emanations were. He explained that one of the most dramatic legacies the old seers had left us was their discovery that the reason for the existence of all sentient beings is to enhance awareness. Don Juan called it a colossal discovery. In a half-serious tone, he asked me if I knew of a better answer to the question that has always haunted man, the reason for our existence. I immediately took a defensive position and began to argue about the meaninglessness of the question because it cannot be logically answered. I told him that in order to discuss that subject, we would have to talk about religious beliefs and turn it all into a matter of faith. The old seers were not just talking about faith, he said. They were not as practical as the new seers, but they were practical enough to know what they were seeing. What I was trying to point out to you with that question, which has rattled you so badly, is that our rationality alone cannot come up with an answer about the reason for our existence. Every time it tries, the answer turns into a matter of beliefs. The old seers took another road, and they did find an answer, which doesn't involve faith alone. He said that the old seers, risking untold dangers, actually saw the indescribable force, which is the source of all sentient beings. They called it the eagle, because in the few glimpses that they could sustain, they saw it as something that resembled a black and white eagle of infinite size. They saw that it is the eagle who bestows awareness. The eagle creates sentient beings so that they will live and enrich the awareness it gives them with life. They also saw that it is the eagle who devours that same enriched awareness after making sentient beings relinquish it at the moment of death. For the old seers, Don Juan went on to say that the reason for existence is to enhance awareness is not a matter of faith or deduction. They saw it. They saw that the awareness of sentient beings flies away at the moment of death and floats like a luminous cotton puff right into the eagle's beak to be consumed. For the old seers, that was the evidence that sentient beings live only to enrich the awareness that is the eagle's food. Don Juan's elucidation was interrupted because he had to leave on a short business trip. Nestor drove him to Oaxaca. As I saw them off, I remembered that at the beginning of my association with Don Juan, every time he mentioned a business trip, I thought he was employing a euphemism for something else. I eventually realized that he meant what he said. Whenever such a trip was about to take place, he would put on one of his many immaculately tailored three-piece suits and would look like anything but the old Indian I knew. I had commented to him about the sophistication of his metamorphosis. A Nahual is someone flexible enough to be anything, he had said. To be a Nahual, among other things, means to have no points to defend. Remember this. We'll come back to it over and over. We had come back to it over and over, in every possible way. He did indeed seem to have no points to defend. But during his absence in Oaxaca, I was given to just a shadow of doubt. Suddenly I realized that a Nahual did have one point to defend. The description of the eagle and what it does required, in my opinion, a passionate defense. I tried to pose that question to some of Don Juan's companions, but they eluded my probings. They told me that I was in quarantine from that kind of discussion until Don Juan had finished his explanation. The moment he returned, we sat down to talk, and I asked him about it. "Those truths are not something to defend passionately," he replied. "If you think that I'm trying to defend them, you are mistaken. Those truths were put together for the delight and enlightenment of warriors, not to engage any proprietary sentiments. When I told you that a Nahual has no points to defend, I meant, among other things, that a Nahual has no obsessions." I told him that I was not following his teachings, for I had become obsessed with his description of the eagle and what it does. I remarked over and over about the awesomeness of such an idea. "It is not just an idea," he said. "It is a fact, and a damn scary one, if you ask me." The new seers were not simply playing with ideas. But what kind of force would the eagle be? I wouldn't know how to answer that. The eagle is as real for the seers as gravity and time are for you, and just as abstract and incomprehensible. Wait a minute, Don Juan. Those are abstract concepts, but they do refer to real phenomena that can be corroborated. There are whole disciplines dedicated to that. The eagle and its emanations are equally corroboratable. Don Juan retorted. And the discipline of the new seers is dedicated to doing just that. I asked him to explain what the eagle's emanations are. He said that the eagle's emanations are an immutable thing in itself, which engulfs everything that exists, the knowable and the unknowable. There is no way to describe in words what the eagle's emanations really are. Don Juan continued. A seer must witness them. Have you witnessed them yourself, Don Juan? Of course I have. And yet I can't tell you what they are. They are a presence, almost a mass of sorts, a pressure that creates a dazzling sensation. One can catch only a glimpse of them, as one can catch only a glimpse of the eagle itself. Would you say, Don Juan, that the eagle is the source of the emanations? It goes without saying that the eagle is the source of its emanations. I meant to ask if that is so visually. There is nothing visual about the eagle. The entire body of a seer senses the eagle. There is something in all of us that can make us witness with our entire body. Seers explain the act of seeing the eagle in very simple terms, because man is composed of the eagle's emanations. Man need only revert back to his components. The problem arises with man's awareness. It is his awareness that becomes entangled and confused. At the crucial moment when it should be a simple case of the emanations acknowledging themselves, man's awareness is compelled to interpret. The result is a vision of the eagle and the eagle's emanations. But there is no eagle and no eagle's emanations. What is out there is something that no living creature can grasp. I asked him if the source of the emanations was called the eagle, because eagles in general have important attributes. This is simply the case of something unknowable, vaguely resembling something known, he replied. On account of that, there have certainly been attempts to imbue eagles with attributes they don't have. But that always happens when impressionable people learn to perform acts that require great sobriety. Seers come in all sizes and shapes. Do you mean to say that there are different kinds of seers? No, I mean that there are scores of imbeciles who become seers. Seers are human beings full of foibles, or rather, human beings full of foibles are capable of becoming seers. Just as in the case of miserable people who become superb scientists. The characteristic of miserable seers is that they are willing to forget the wonder of the world. They become overwhelmed by the fact that they see and believe that it's their genius that counts. A seer must be a paragon in order to override the nearly invincible laxness of our human condition. More important than seeing itself is what seers do with what they see. What do you mean by that, Don Juan? Look at what some seers have done to us. We are stuck with their vision of an eagle that rules us and devours us at the moment of our death. He said that there is a definite laxness in that version, and that personally he did not appreciate the idea of something devouring us. For him, it would be more accurate to say that there is a force that attracts our consciousness, much as a magnet attracts iron shavings. At the moment of dying, all of our being disintegrates under the attraction of that immense force. That such an event was interpreted as the eagle devouring us, he found grotesque, because it turns an indescribable act into something as mundane as eating. I'm a very average man, I said. The description of an eagle that devours us had a great impact on me. The real impact can't be measured until the moment when you see it yourself, he said. But you must bear in mind that our flaws remain with us even after we become seers. So when you see that force, you may very well agree with the lax seers who called it the eagle, as I did myself. On the other hand, you may not. You may resist the temptation to ascribe human attributes to what is incomprehensible and actually improvise a new name for it, a more accurate one. Seers who see the eagle's emanations often called them commands, Don Juan said. I wouldn't mind calling them commands myself if I hadn't got used to calling them emanations. It was a reaction to my benefactor's preference. For him, they were commands. I thought that term was more in keeping with his forceful personality than with mine. I wanted something impersonal. Commands sounds too human to me. But that's what they really are. Commands. Don Juan said that to see the eagle's emanations is to court disaster. The new seers soon discovered the tremendous difficulties involved, and only after great tribulations in trying to map the unknown and separate it from the unknowable did they realize that everything is made out of the eagle's emanations. Only a small portion of those emanations is within reach of human awareness. And that small portion is still further reduced to a minute fraction by the constraints of our daily lives. That minute fraction of the eagle's emanations is the known. The small portion within possible reach of human awareness is the unknown. And the incalculable rest is the unknowable. He went on to say that the new seers, being pragmatically oriented, became immediately cognizant of the compelling power of the emanations. They realized that all living creatures are forced to employ the eagle's emanations without ever knowing what they are. They also realized that organisms are constructed to grasp a certain range of those emanations, and that every species has a definite range. The emanations exert great pressure on organisms, and through that pressure, organisms construct their perceivable world. In our case, as human beings, Don Juan said, we employ those emanations and interpret them as reality. But what man senses is such a small portion of the eagle's emanations that it's ridiculous to put much stock in our perceptions. And yet, it isn't possible for us to disregard our perceptions. The new seers found this out the hard way, after courting tremendous dangers. Don Juan was sitting where he usually sat in the large room. Ordinarily, there was no furniture in that room. People sat on mats on the floor. But Carol, the Nahual woman, had managed to furnish it with very comfortable armchairs for the sessions when she and I took turns reading to him from the works of Spanish-speaking poets. I want you to be very aware of what we are doing, he said as soon as I sat down. We are discussing the mastery of awareness. The truths we're discussing are the principles of that mastery. He added that in his teachings for the right side, he had demonstrated those principles to my normal awareness with the help of one of his seer companions, Gennaro. And that Gennaro had played around with my awareness with all the humor and irreverence for which the new seers were known. Gennaro is the one who should be here telling you about the eagle, he said. Except that his versions are too irreverent. He thinks that the seers who called that force the eagle were either very stupid or were making a grand joke, because eagles not only lay eggs, they also lay turds. Don Juan laughed and said that he found Gennaro's comments so appropriate that he couldn't resist laughter. He added that if the new seers had been the ones to describe the eagle, the description would certainly have been made half in fun. I told Don Juan that on one level I took the eagle as a poetic image, and as such it delighted me. But on another level I took it literally, and that terrified me. One of the greatest forces in the lives of a warrior is fear, he said. It spurs them to learn. He reminded me that the description of the eagle came from the ancient seers. The new seers were through with description, comparison, and conjecture of any sort. They wanted to get directly to the source of things, and consequently risked unlimited danger to get to it. They did see the eagle's emanations, but they never tampered with the description of the eagle. They felt that it took too much energy to see the eagle, and that the ancient seers had already paid heavily for their scant glimpse of the unknowable. How did the old seers come around to describing the eagle? I asked. They needed a minimal set of guidelines about the unknowable for purposes of instruction, he replied. They resolved it with a sketchy description of the force that rules all there is, but not of its emanations, because the emanations cannot be rendered at all in a language of comparisons. Individual seers may feel the urge to make comments about certain emanations, but that will remain personal. In other words, there is no pat version of the emanations, as there is of the eagle. The new seers seem to have been very abstract, I commented. They sound like modern-day philosophers. No, the new seers were terribly practical men, he replied. They weren't involved in concocting rational theories. He said that the ancient seers were the ones who were the abstract thinkers. They built monumental edifices of abstractions proper to them and their time. And just like the modern-day philosophers, they were not at all in control of their concatenations. The new seers, on the other hand, imbued with practicality, were able to see a flux of emanations and to see how man and other living beings utilize them to construct their perceivable world. How are those emanations utilized by man, Don Juan? It's so simple it sounds idiotic. For a seer, men are luminous beings. Our luminosity is made up of that portion of the eagle's emanations, which is encased in our egg-like cocoon. That particular portion, that handful of emanations that is encased, is what makes us men. To perceive is to match the emanations contained inside our cocoon with those that are outside. Seers can see, for instance, the emanations inside any living creature and can tell which of the outside emanations would match them. Are the emanations like beams of light? I asked. No, not at all. That would be too simple. They are something indescribable. And yet, my personal comment would be to say that they are like filaments of light. What's incomprehensible to normal awareness is that the filaments are aware. I can't tell you what that means because I don't know what I am saying. All I can tell you with my personal comments is that the filaments are aware of themselves, alive and vibrating, that there are so many of them that numbers have no meaning, and that each of them is an eternity in itself. Chapter 4. The Glow of Awareness. Don Juan, Don Gennaro, and I had just returned from gathering plants in the surrounding mountains. We were at Don Gennaro's house, sitting around the table, when Don Juan made me change levels of awareness. Don Gennaro had been staring at me and began to chuckle. He remarked how odd he thought it was that I had two completely different standards for dealing with the two sides of awareness. My relation with him was the most obvious example. On my right side, he was the respected and feared sorcerer, Don Gennaro, a man whose incomprehensible acts delighted me and at the same time filled me with mortal terror. On my left side, he was plain Gennaro, or Gennarito, with no Don attached to his name. A charming and kind seer whose acts were thoroughly comprehensible and coherent with what I myself did or tried to do. I agreed with him and added that on my left side, the man whose mere presence made me shake like a leaf was Silvio Manuel, the most mysterious of Don Juan's companions. I also said that Don Juan, being a true Nahual, transcended arbitrary standards and was respected and admired by me in both states. But is he feared? Gennaro asked in a quivering voice. Very feared, Don Juan interjected in a falsetto voice. We all laughed, but Don Juan and Gennaro laughed with such abandon that I immediately suspected they knew something they were holding back. Don Juan was reading me like a book. He explained that in the intermediate stage, before one enters fully into the left side awareness, one is capable of tremendous concentration, but one is also susceptible to every conceivable influence. I was being influenced by suspicion. La Gorda is always at this stage, he said. She learns beautifully, but she's a royal pain in the neck. She can't help being driven by anything that comes her way, including, of course, very good things, like keen concentration. Don Juan explained that the new seers discovered that the transition period is the time when the deepest learning takes place, and that it is also the time when warriors must be supervised and explanations must be given to them so they can evaluate them properly. If no explanations are given to them before they enter into the left side, they will be great sorcerers, but poor seers, as the ancient Toltecs were. Female warriors in particular fall prey to the lure of the left side, he said. They are so nimble that they can go into the left side with no effort, often too soon for their own good. After a long silence, Gennaro fell asleep. Don Juan began to speak. He said that the new seers had had to invent a number of terms in order to explain the second truth about awareness. His benefactor had changed some of those terms to suit himself, and he himself had done the same, guided by the seer's belief that it does not make any difference what terms are used, as long as the truths have been verified by seeing. I was curious to know what terms he had changed, but I didn't know quite how to word my question. He took it that I was doubting his right or his ability to change them, and explained that if the terms we propose originate in our reason, they can only communicate the mundane agreement of everyday life. When seers propose a term, on the other hand, it is never a figure of speech, because it stems from seeing and embraces everything that seers can attain. I asked him why he had changed the terms. It's a Nahual's duty always to look for better ways to explain, he replied. Time changes everything, and every new Nahual has to incorporate new words, new ideas to describe his seeing. Do you mean that a Nahual takes ideas from the world of everyday life? I asked. No, I mean that a Nahual talks about seeing in ever new ways, he said. For instance, as the new Nahual, you'd have to say that awareness gives rise to perception. You'd be saying the same thing my benefactor said, but in a different way. What do the new seers say perception is, Don Juan? They say that perception is a condition of alignment. The emanations inside the cocoon become aligned with those outside that fit them. Alignment is what allows awareness to be cultivated by every living creature. Seers make these statements because they see living creatures as they really are. Luminous beings that look like bubbles of whitish light. I asked him how the emanations inside the cocoon fit those outside so as to accomplish perception. The emanations inside and the emanations outside, he said, are the same filaments of light. Sentient beings are minute bubbles made out of those filaments, microscopic points of light attached to infinite emanations. He went on to explain that the luminosity of living beings is made by the particular portion of the ego's emanations they happen to have inside their luminous cocoons. When seers see perception, they witness that the luminosity of the ego's emanations outside those creatures' cocoons brightens the luminosity of the emanations inside their cocoons. The outside luminosity attracts the inside one. It traps it, so to speak, and fixes it. That fixation is the awareness of every specific being. Seers can also see how the emanations outside the cocoon exert a particular pressure on the portion of emanations inside. This pressure determines the degree of awareness that every living being has. I asked him to clarify how those eagle's emanations outside the cocoon exert pressure on those inside. The eagle's emanations are more than filaments of light, he replied. Each one of them is a source of boundless energy. Think of it this way. Since some of the emanations outside the cocoon are the same as the emanations inside, their energies are like a continuous pressure. But the cocoon isolates the emanations that are inside its web and thereby directs the pressure. I've mentioned to you that the old seers were masters of the art of handling awareness, he went on. What I can add now is that they were the masters of that art because they learned to manipulate the structure of man's cocoon. I've said to you that they unraveled the mystery of being aware. By that, I meant that they saw and realized that awareness is a glow in the cocoon of living beings. They rightly called it the glow of awareness. He explained that the old seers saw that man's awareness is a glow of amber luminosity, more intense than the rest of the cocoon. That glow is on a narrow, vertical band on the extreme right side of the cocoon, running along its entire length. The mastery of the old seers was to move that glow, to make it spread from its original setting on the surface of the cocoon inward across its width. He stopped talking and looked at Gennaro, who was still sound asleep. Gennaro doesn't give a fig about explanations, he said. He's a doer. My benefactor pushed him constantly to face insoluble problems. So he entered into the left side proper and never had a chance to ponder and wonder. Is it better to be that way, Don Juan? It depends. For him, it's perfect. For you and for me, it wouldn't be satisfactory. Because in one way or another, we are called upon to explain. Gennaro, or my benefactor, are more like the old than the new seers. They can control and do what they want with the glow of awareness. He stood up from the mat where we were sitting and stretched his arms and legs. I pressed him to continue talking. He smiled and said that I needed to rest, that my concentration was waning. There was a knock at the door. I woke up. It was dark. For a moment, I could not remember where I was. There was something in me that was far away, as if part of me were still asleep, yet I was fully awake. Enough moonlight came through the open window so that I could see. I saw Don Gennaro get up and go to the door. I realized then that I was at his house. Don Juan was sound asleep on a mat on the floor. I had the distinct impression that the three of us had fallen asleep after returning dead tired from a trip to the mountains. Don Gennaro lit his kerosene lantern. I followed him into the kitchen. Someone had brought him a pot of hot stew and a stack of tortillas. "Who brought you food?" I asked him. "Do you have a woman around here that cooks for you?" Don Juan had come into the kitchen. Both of them looked at me, smiling. For some reason, their smiles were terrifying to me. I was about to scream in terror. In fact, when Don Juan hit me on the back and made me shift into a state of heightened awareness. I realized then that perhaps during my sleep, or as I woke up, I had drifted back to everyday awareness. The sensation I experienced then, once I was back in heightened awareness, was a mixture of relief and anger, and the most acute sadness. I was relieved that I was myself again, for I had come to regard those incomprehensible states as being my true self. There was one simple reason for that. In those states, I felt complete. Nothing was missing from me. The anger and the sadness were a reaction to impotence. I was more aware than ever of the limitations of my being. I asked Don Juan to explain to me how it was possible for me to do what I was doing. In states of heightened awareness, I could look back and remember everything about myself. I could give an account of everything I had done in either state. I could even remember my incapacity to recollect. But once I had returned to my normal, everyday level of awareness, I could not recall anything I had done in a heightened state of awareness, even if my life depended on it. Hold it there," he said. "You haven't remembered anything yet. Heightened awareness is only an intermediate state. There is infinitely more beyond that. And you have been there many, many times. Right now you can't remember, even if your life depends on it." He was right. I had no idea what he was talking about. I pleaded for an explanation. "The explanation is coming," he said. "It's a slow process, but we'll get to it. It is slow because I am just like you. I like to understand. I am the opposite of my benefactor, who was not given to explaining. For him, there was only action. He used to put us squarely against incomprehensible problems and let us resolve them for ourselves. Some of us never did resolve anything, and we ended up very much in the same boat with the old seers. All action and no real knowledge." "Are those memories trapped in my mind?" I asked. "No, that would make it too simple," he replied. "The actions of seers are more complex than dividing a man into mind and body. You have forgotten what you've done or what you've witnessed, because when you were performing what you've forgotten, you were seeing." I asked Don Juan to reinterpret what he had just said. Patiently, he explained that everything I had forgotten had taken place in states in which my everyday awareness had been enhanced, intensified, a condition that meant that other areas of my total being were used. Whatever you've forgotten is trapped in those areas of your total being, he said. To be using those other areas is to see. I'm more confused than ever, Don Juan, I said. I don't blame you, he said. Seeing is to lay bare the core of everything, to witness the unknown and to glimpse into the unknowable. As such, it doesn't bring one solace. Seers ordinarily go to pieces on finding out that existence is incomprehensibly complex and that our normal awareness maligns it with its limitations. He reiterated that my concentration had to be total, that to understand was of crucial importance, that the new seers placed the highest value on deep, unemotional realizations. For instance, the other day, he went on, when you understood about La Gordas and your self-importance, you didn't understand anything really. You had an emotional outburst. That was all. I say this because the next day you were back on your high horse of self-importance, as if you had never realized anything. The same thing happened to the old seers. They were given to emotional reactions. But when the time came for them to understand what they had seen, they couldn't do it. To understand, one needs sobriety, not emotionality. Beware of those who weep with realization, for they have realized nothing. There are untold dangers in the path of knowledge for those without sober understanding, he continued. I am outlining the order in which the new seers arranged the truths about awareness, so it will serve you as a map that you have to corroborate with your seeing, but not with your eyes. There was a long pause. He stared at me. He was definitely waiting for me to ask him a question. Everybody falls prey to the mistake that seeing is done with the eyes, he continued. But don't be surprised that after so many years you haven't realized yet that seeing is not a matter of the eyes. It's quite normal to make that mistake. What is seeing then? I asked. He replied that seeing is alignment. And I reminded him that he had said that perception is alignment. He explained then that the alignment of emanations used routinely is the perception of the day-to-day world. But the alignment of emanations that are never used ordinarily is seen. When such an alignment occurs, one sees. Seeing, therefore, being produced by alignment out of the ordinary, cannot be something one could merely look at. He said that in spite of the fact that I had seen countless times, it had not occurred to me to disregard my eyes. I had succumbed to the way seeing is labeled and described. When seers see, something explains everything as the new alignment takes place. He continued. It's a voice that tells them in their ear what's what. If that voice is not present, what the seer is engaged in isn't seen. After a moment's pause, he continued explaining the voice of seeing. He said that it was equally fallacious to say that seeing was hearing, because it was infinitely more than that, but that seers had opted for using sound as a gauge of new alignment. He called the voice of seeing a most mysterious, inexplicable thing. My personal conclusion is that the voice of seeing belongs only to man, he said. It may happen because talking is something that no one else besides man does. The old seers believed it was the voice of an overpowering entity intimately related to mankind, a protector of man. The new seers found out that that entity, which they called the mold of man, doesn't have a voice. The voice of seeing for the new seers is something quite incomprehensible. They say it's the glow of awareness playing on the eagle's emanations, as a harpist plays on a harp. He refused to explain it any further, arguing that later on, as he proceeded with his explanation, everything would become clear to me. My concentration had been so total while Don Juan spoke that I actually did not remember sitting down at the table to eat. When Don Juan stopped talking, I noticed that his plate of stew was nearly finished. Gennaro was staring at me with a beaming smile. My plate was in front of me on the table, and it too was empty. There was only a tiny residue of stew left in it, as if I had just finished eating. I did not remember eating at all, but neither did I remember walking to the table or sitting down. "Did you like the stew?" Gennaro asked me and looked away. I said I did, because I did not want to admit that I was having problems recollecting. "It had too much chili for my taste," Gennaro said. "You never eat hot food yourself, so I'm sort of worried about what it will do to you. You shouldn't have eaten 2 servings. I suppose you're a little more piggish when you're in heightened awareness, huh?" I admitted that he was probably right. He handed me a large pitcher of water to quench my thirst and soothe my throat. When I eagerly drank all of it, both of them broke into howling laughter. Suddenly I realized what was going on. My realization was physical. It was a flash of yellowish light that hit me as if a match had been struck right between my eyes. I knew then that Gennaro was joking. I had not eaten. I had been so absorbed in Don Juan's explanation that I had forgotten about everything else. The plate in front of me was Gennaro's. After dinner, Don Juan went on with his explanation about the glow of awareness. Gennaro sat by me, listening as if he had never heard the explanation before. Don Juan said that the pressure that the emanations outside the cocoon, which are called emanations at large, exert on the emanations inside the cocoon is the same in all sentient beings. Yet the results of that pressure are vastly different among them, because their cocoons react to that pressure in every conceivable way. There are, however, degrees of uniformity within certain boundaries. Now, he went on, when seers see that the pressure of the emanations at large bears down on the emanations inside, which are always in motion, and makes them stop moving, they know that the luminous being at that moment is fixated by awareness. To say that the emanations at large bear down on those inside the cocoon and make them stop moving means that seers see something indescribable, the meaning of which they know without a shadow of doubt. It means that the voice of seeing has told them that the emanations inside the cocoon are completely at rest and match some of those which are outside. He said that seers maintain naturally that awareness always comes from outside ourselves, that the real mystery is not inside us, since by nature the emanations at large are made to fixate what is inside the cocoon. The trick of awareness is to let the fixating emanations merge with what is inside us. Seers believe that if we let that happen, we become what we really are, fluid, forever in motion, eternal. There was a long pause. Don Juan's eyes had an intense shine. They seemed to be looking at me from a great depth. I had the feeling that each of his eyes was an independent point of brilliance. For an instant, he appeared to be struggling against an invincible force, a fire from within that intended to consume him. It passed, and he went on talking. The degree of awareness of every individual sentient being, he continued, depends on the degree to which it is capable of letting the pressure of the emanations at large carry it. After a long interruption, Don Juan continued explaining. He said that seers saw that from the moment of conception, awareness is enhanced, enriched by the process of being alive. He said that seers saw, for instance, that the awareness of an individual insect or that of an individual man grows from the moment of conception in astoundingly different ways, but with equal consistency. Is it from the moment of conception or from the moment of birth that awareness develops? I asked. Awareness develops from the moment of conception, he replied. I have always told you that sexual energy is something of ultimate importance and that it has to be controlled and used with great care. But you have always resented what I said because you thought I was speaking of control in terms of morality. I always meant it in terms of saving and rechanneling energy. Don Juan looked at Gennaro. Gennaro nodded his head in approval. Gennaro is going to tell you what our benefactor, the Nahual Julian, used to say about saving and rechanneling sexual energy, Don Juan said to me. The Nahual Julian used to say that to have sex is a matter of energy, Gennaro began. For instance, he never had any problems having sex because he had bushels of energy. But he took one look at me and prescribed right away that my Peter was just for peeing. He told me that I didn't have enough energy to have sex. He said that my parents were too bored and too tired when they made me. He said that I was the result of very boring sex. Cogida aburrida. I was born like that, bored and tired. The Nahual Julian recommended that people like me should never have sex. This way, we can store the little energy we have. He said the same thing to Silvio Manuel and to Emilito. He saw that the others had enough energy. They were not the result of bored sex. He told them that they could do anything they wanted with their sexual energy. But he recommended that they control themselves and understand the eagle's command, that sex is for bestowing the glow of awareness. We all said we had understood. One day, without any warning at all, he opened the curtain of the other world with the help of his own benefactor, the Nahual Elias, and pushed all of us inside with no hesitation whatsoever. All of us, except Silvio Manuel, nearly died in there. We had no energy to withstand the impact of the other world. None of us, except Silvio Manuel, had followed the Nahual's recommendation. What is the curtain of the other world? I asked Don Juan. What Gennaro said. It is a curtain, Don Juan replied. But you're getting off the subject. You always do. We're talking about the eagle's command about sex. It is the eagle's command that sexual energy be used for creating life. Through sexual energy, the eagle bestows awareness. So when sentient beings are engaged in sexual intercourse, the emanations inside their cocoons do their best to bestow awareness to the new sentient being they are creating. He said that during the sexual act, the emanations encased inside the cocoon of both partners undergo a profound agitation, the culminating point of which is a merging, a fusing of two pieces of the glow of awareness, one from each partner, that separate from their cocoons. Sexual intercourse is always a bestowal of awareness, even though the bestowal may not be consolidated, he went on. The emanations inside the cocoon of human beings don't know of intercourse for fun. Gennaro leaned over toward me from his chair across the table and talked to me in a low voice, shaking his head for emphasis. The Nahual is telling you the truth, he said, and winked at me. Those emanations really don't know. Don Juan fought not to laugh, and added that the fallacy of man is to act with total disregard for the mystery of existence, and to believe that such a sublime act of bestowing life and awareness is merely a physical drive that one can twist at will. Gennaro made some obscene sexual gestures, twisting his pelvis around, on and on. Don Juan nodded and said that that was exactly what he meant. Gennaro thanked him for acknowledging his one and only contribution to the explanation of awareness. Both of them laughed like idiots, saying that if I had known how serious their benefactor was about the explanation of awareness, I would be laughing with them. I earnestly asked Don Juan what all this meant for an average man in the day-to-day world. You mean what Gennaro is doing? He asked me in mock seriousness. Their glee was always contagious. It took a long time for them to calm down. Their level of energy was so high that next to them, I seemed old and decrepit. I really don't know, Don Juan finally answered me. All I know is what it means to warriors. They know that the only real energy we possess is a life-bestowing sexual energy. This knowledge makes them permanently conscious of their responsibility. If warriors want to have enough energy to see, they must become misers with their sexual energy. That was the lesson the Nahual Julian gave us. He pushed us into the unknown, and we all nearly died. Since every one of us wanted to see, we, of course, abstained from wasting our glow of awareness. I had heard him voice that belief before. Every time he did, we got into an argument. I always felt compelled to protest and raise objections to what I thought was a puritanical attitude toward sex. I again raised my objections. Both of them laughed to tears. What can be done with man's natural sensuality? I asked Don Juan. Nothing, he replied. There is nothing wrong with man's sensuality. It's man's ignorance of and disregard for his magical nature that is wrong. It's a mistake to waste recklessly the life-bestowing force of sex and not have children. But it's also a mistake not to know that in having children, one taxes the glow of awareness. How do seers know that having children taxes the glow of awareness? I asked. They see that on having a child, the parent's glow of awareness diminishes and the child's increases. In some supersensitive, frail parents, the glow of awareness almost disappears. As children enhance their awareness, a big dark spot develops in the luminous cocoon of the parents, on the very place from which the glow was taken away. It is usually on the midsection of the cocoon. Sometimes those spots can even be seen superimposed on the body itself. I asked him if there was anything that could be done to give people a more balanced understanding of the glow of awareness. Nothing, he said. At least, there is nothing that seers can do. Seers aim to be free, to be unbiased witnesses, incapable of passing judgment. Otherwise, they would have to assume the responsibility for bringing about a more adjusted cycle. No one can do that. The new cycle, if it is to come, must come of itself.